So our next speaker is Sebastian Job, who's speaking on the light of the toad of light. And he's particularly interested in the experience of 5-MeO-DMT sourced from toads and the socio-cultural significance of that. And Sebastian is an Honorary Associate, which I think the abbreviation for that is ONAS, at the Department of Anthropology at University of Sydney. And he's also a visiting lecturer at the National Institute of Dramatic Art. His research in recent years has centred around the use of entheogens, both in Australia and Latin America. And he's particularly interested in the environmental, political and philosophical significance of the cultures of use of these substances. Please welcome Sebastian Job.
Thanks, Steve. I should probably say from the beginning that I've named this the light of the toad of light, not because I want to focus particularly on the toad, but because the main case study, or the only case study that I want to present, is one where there's the ritualistic use of the venom of Bufo alvarius or Encilius alvarius, the Sonoran desert toad, or the Colorado river toad, which is a semi-aquatic amphibian from the the northwest of Mexico and the southwest of the United States, which mainly lives underground most of its life. And the toad has sort of come on the scene in, I guess, subcultural sense with kind of force in the last couple of years. And that's a kind of story for another day, which also I don't know well enough. And I don't actually want to focus primarily on the toad versus synthetic 5-MeO-DMT, which is a matter of significance for some people. They emphasize the difference. And between, within the context of synthetic 5-MeO-DMT on the one side and a toad venom on the other side, there are people who, I think rightfully, would emphasize also the distinction between relatively informal use and relatively ritualized, or as we might say, entheogenic uses. However, I don't want to focus on that. I really want to focus more on what I've mentioned there in the subtitle, the transpersonal dimension, which is to say the universal or maybe common human dimension. And this is always a kind of tricky zone, because one of the things that people always emphasize about these very powerful kinds of experiences is that words fail. And so then when one tries to sort of delimit what is universal, you're always in the midst of words, you're in the midst of interpretations. And to sort of further level of complexity is that interpretations may well enter into the very nature of the experience. Even if it's beyond words, the way that the person experiences it may have to do with their own socio-cultural formation, their own, whatever baggage they carry in, how explosive, how much baggage they have to leave behind, etc. All of that. And that's also kind of, in some ways, a symbolic or conceptual matter. Nonetheless, I want to have a go at focusing on that transpersonal dimension. I have a sense that what I might say could come across a little bit as a sort of advertisement for the toad venom or for the 5-MeO-DMT synthesized version. I don't intend it that way. I am going to be looking at a very positive case. My general preliminary investigations are that the majority of experiences are very valuable so far that I've come across, but there are also what we could say very difficult experiences, some experiences that some people regret. There are also issues to do with the conservation of the toad, etc. So all of that stuff, I guess, I just want to mention because I'll be putting forward a kind of prototypical or possibly prototypical experience which doesn't touch on those areas. Finally, the last thing I should say is I haven't smoked the toad. And it probably seems foolhardy to stand here and talk about something you haven't done. I, particularly as an anthropologist, because participant observation is the stock in trade, I'm nonetheless doing it because I have smoked the synthetic 5-MeO. That's kind of irrelevant because I didn't break through. So, but I've had a little bit of a taste. More to the point is I've had ayahuasca brews, which are high in 5-MeO, and have definitely gone through to an ayahuasca version, I think, of the type of state that is going to be presented here. So, let's see if this works. Yeah, so that's just a picture of the molecule itself. And I want to draw your attention to a putative or possible chemical cascade, an enzymatic chemical cascade endogenous to the human body that may well operate. And this is according to Mantak Chia in a very interesting book, Dark Room Enlightenment, where he suggests that starting off with the essential acid tryptophan, you can go through enzymatic synthesis to serotonin, melatonin, pinolene, 5-MeO DMT, and on to DMT. And you know, we now know that DMT is an endogenous neurotransmitter. I haven't been able to locate authoritative research about 5-MeO DMT, but it stands to reason that there is some kind of endogenous functionality. What Mantak Chia is suggesting is that on the basis of the well-known fact that if you sit in a dark room or a cave without any light for a week, 2 weeks, the lights come on. The lights come on inside. The inner light comes on. And his supposition is that 5-MeO DMT and DMT are the biochemical components of that inner light, or among the components of that inner light. And it strikes me as really interesting because it potentially sets up a biochemical link to the primary mystical states that, at least since what is called the axial age, the age of Lao Tzu, Buddha, Socrates, the early Hebrew prophets, this sort of the age of the breakthrough in the Bronze Age civilizations in the Far East, in the Middle East, that there may be a biochemical link to what was the sort of central experience, variously interpreted, of these different cultures, and that includes the West. So I just want to give you one, actually it's not one, I think it is the kind of example, because the allegory of the cave from Plato's Republic is probably the best known myth in Western philosophy, where Socrates, the interlocutor in the Republic, tries to demonstrate the difference between ignorance and wisdom, between the everyday opinions that we trade back and forth, or what he calls doxa, and episteme, which is true knowledge. And he suggests that everyday life, we're stuck in this cave, or to use a contemporary reference, a matrix, which is actually also an ancient reference, trading opinions about shadows which are merely copies of images, which are themselves sort of distant relatives of the ideal forms. And so the philosopher, the lover of wisdom, is the one who goes out of the cave and whose knowledge ascends to the form of the good. And he uses the sun as an analogy for the form of the good. So it's not that the sun is the good, but because the sun provides the light, then analogously, the form of the good is that imperceptible source from which rational, or let's say the logos, the divine logos, the ideal forms are intuited. And that's the basis of true knowledge and true ethical, moral comportment. So what strikes me as really significant is that in this myth, Plato has the philosopher leave the cave. And it strikes me that that is in a way a kind of fatal decision that has echoed down the years. Because if we contrast it with, say, the tradition of Dzogchen Buddhism, where one at least in the Evans-Wentz translation of a Dzogchen key text, you translated the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the idea is to embrace or be embraced by the clear light as total unification with Source, or better put, getting rid of whatever is blocking us from understanding that we are already here in the unmanifest, unconditioned, luminescent, eternal being that is and always will be. That's front and center with, for example, Dzogchen Buddhism, and arguably also with Vedanta in the Hindu tradition. In the West, in the Abrahamic traditions, it's pushed off to the side. And even in Plato, there's ambiguity. And what I've come to understand, I think, is that this ambiguity about whether or not the source, the goal, is somehow transcendent to us, outside us, like for example, transcendent God, or whether it's utterly internal, that this ambivalence characterizes, it has so many implications for how people understand the possibility of, if you want to put it, self-realization, or the raison d'etre of a civilization. But the problem is that it's actually intrinsic maybe to the experience. So now I want to run through to, I'm going to skip this because I'm probably running out of time. This is just a well-known Ralph Hood's M scale, mysticism scale, which looks at these transpersonal universal dimensions of typical mystical experiences. And the point is that the 5-MeO DMT synthetic or natural versions, it hits all of those when there's full breakthrough, typically, and it hits a number of others. So I want to just move on to the testimony of a Mexican guy, Enrique, who was for quite some time addicted to methamphetamine, and he put himself into rehab. He'd also tried peyote and salvia divinorum and other substances, but not in a ritualistic manner. He got off the meth, but he was really craving it, and so he substituted food. He put on 25 kilos in 3 months. He was pretty at a low ebb. And then he had an opportunity to take the purification medicine, as he called it, with a shaman called Luis Sanchez, who's sort of in the lineage of a shaman who's come out, or a mestizo shaman who's come out of an encounter with the Seri people in Sonora. I say shaman here because this is the terminology which is being used, even though there is probably no indigenous tradition, at least that we can be sure about, of smoking the toad. I can't be sure about that. But in any case, people are related to as shamans. So, Enrique has generously described his experience. And to begin with, 30 seconds after inhaling the toad venom, he had this sense of vertiginous flight, incredible force. And then the first place that the medicine conducted him to was into what he called his lower vibrations. And he said it was terrifying. It was the place of his envy, his anger, his rancor. And down there, he got an insight, or he said he understood the source of his addiction, just like that. He saw that his addiction was a way of avoiding a key wound that he'd received when he was a much younger person. And so, just cut me off if I go on too long, sorry. Yeah. So what he then said, I'll just go to that. So this is, you see him collapsing 30 seconds after he smoked the toad. This is from a 20-minute video that he made available, and this is at the early point. Then the next stage was a letting go. I might just say that this is sort of obviously reminiscent or an instance of the archetypal shamanic journey to the underworld here, literally the sort of hell of your own uncontrolled base nature. And we're familiar with this, in the West from Orpheus or from even Ulysses going to the underworld. The next stage is ego loss or letting go. I've put in this as letting the personal I go. And he said, I just let go, let go, let go, let go, let go. And I let go of everything that unconsciously had been part of myself. And I put it here as letting the personal I go because we're familiar, again, anybody who's read Jung or Joseph Campbell around the idea of ego death or loss of the ego. I think that there's a tendency to think that the ego is like something that, that's not really me, because we don't generally relate first person to ourselves as an ego. And he lost it. He lost it all. This is the moment of surrender. And finally, we get to really the kind of key, the climax of the whole thing, which he described as an interminable orgasm of the heart and the soul. I want to read this to you because brings us back to that Platonic opposition that I mentioned before between the transcendent and the immanent. So he says, I started to climb up through different levels, over 10, less than 20. And my brother, he means the shaman, arrived in the center of my existence. I began to experience feelings I didn't believe were compatible with a physical body, an immense expansion of my being, and a light, something like a giant star, came to me and allowed me to fuse with it. And I felt love, absolute and infinite, peace, plenitude, an interminable orgasm that came not from my genitals, but from my heart, from my soul. I think we're obviously in the midst of the curative moment because, this has been a very positive experience. It's completely turned him around. And when you watch the video, it's quite moving because the first thing that he says after he's been down for about 17, 18 minutes, he just starts screeching loud as he can possibly do. He says, te amo, te amo, te amo, I love you, I love you. And he goes on and on and on. And it's quite clear that he means, I love you, my brother, the man who he experiences as having essentially sort of saved his life by providing this medicine. And I think he means he loves his life and he loves his girlfriend. And you can hear her sobbing it because she's behind the camera as she watches, him going through this moment of rapture, which will finally we come to understand what he's been going through. And I guess I just finish up by saying you have to ask yourself, or I would like to ask myself, what might be the potential significance if experiences like this feed into at least Western subcultures or world subcultures more and gain some more cultural legitimacy, at least in those sorts of areas, how we might come to regard our own history and the history of other cultures who have one way or other danced with varying degrees of neurosis around this kind of ecstatic core. Enrique mentions, I remembered that I had been in that place, that I come from there, and there I belong. And this is reminiscent of Plato's idea of anamnesis, that the soul has knowledge of a non-sensible kind, which is, say, not of the senses, but of the rational intellect. It has that knowledge because it used to abide with the form of the good. And then when you're born, you pass through the river Lethe and forget, and then on you go, but you have an original choice coming through there. It's reminiscent of this idea of coming back to what you really are. And, I haven't done the experience, and I don't want to sound like a sort of evangelist for it, but I was very much taken by speaking to a woman in Sweden who has smoked the toad a couple of times, and she told me that she was in the queue waiting to take the toad. and the person in front of her was getting cold feet, and she had a fair bit of trepidation as well. And she heard the shaman speak to the person in front of her, and he said, "Come on, you're one breath away from home." And the person duly went home, and so did she. At least that's how they both experienced it, apparently. So that home apparently is unconditional love, which is quite nice news, I think. So I'll leave it there. And thanks to Enrique and Luis. All right.
So in your research, what you said you didn't really find any traditional evidence of traditional use of 5-MeO.
Sorry, I didn't mean the smoked. There is actually well-attested use of 5-MeO as snuffs and in the ayahuasca.
I understand that. But so the plant sourced 5-MeO. How far back did you trace that, and what were the origins of people using the toads as a source? Do you know? Okay,
so there's been an attempt, when it comes to the toad, there's been an attempt to trace the archaeological motif of the toad, particularly in Mesoamerica. And of course it's difficult to establish that such and such a toad is Bufo alvarius. But it is clear that the toad is a primary or key symbol of the totality in, for example, the Nahuatl-speaking cultures of Mexico. So, this is if anyone's interested in this kind of stuff, I'll just kind of mention at a sort of personal level, when I was in the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, there's an incredible, fearsome statue, something like the Aztec Kali, but very much on their own, called Coatlicue. And Coatlicue, her name is Serpent Skirt, that's how it translates. And she's got a necklace of skulls, and her feet are the feet of an eagle. And she combines serpent and eagle aspects. But she's actually decapitated, and her head is 2 streams of blood in the forms of serpents. And when you consider what this statue has seen, if you know anything about the Aztec cosmology, then it's quite sort of fearsome to be in front of her. What's really interesting is that at the base of Coatlicue, there is a toad. And the toad has skulls at its elbows and knees and ankles and wrists. So it's a fearsome kind of toad. And what it is actually, it's Coatlicue's more primordial form. And if you go back to the what we call Aztec cosmology, you see that this was the form of the Earth Mother when she came out of the primordial waters. Can I just say here, when you're thinking about connecting to the Earth Mother, don't assume that Earth Mother is going to be benevolent. Not at all. That may well require quite a lot of illumination for the goodness to predominate over the rapacious, cannibalistic dimension of the Earth Mother.
Thanks, mate. One more question.
Could you please just describe a little bit about the process of acquiring the medicine from the frog? Is it a secretion? Does it harm the frog? And is it a sustainable practice?
Yeah, so I think technically it's a toad, but yeah, it may well get confused with Philomedusa bicolor, which is the so-called Cambo frog, which is very different. And in the case of the extraction of the venom of Cambo, it does seem to me that the frog is really significantly stressed. And I think that might be because the venom is so good that it just doesn't have anything to worry about. Like, this is the frog which is easily captured because snakes spit it out. It just doesn't run away, it doesn't jump away. The toad's a different matter. It's relatively easily milked, supposedly without harm. But I don't think anybody's checking whether or not people have got dirty fingernails, whether the toad is getting infected. I don't think that there are any studies on what kind of ecological impact this is having. And I have interviewed one guy who's kind of right at the premise of this whole story, because he introduced some of these people to the toad venom in the beginning. And he's very angry about what's happening. His concern is that the narcotraficantes, the drug barons, are moving in to this area, or the would-be teenage narcotraficantes from the city of Hermosillo, which is the capital of Sonora. I've not been there, I don't know. I'm a little bit reluctant to, I've just done it, but in a very minor version, sort of repeat these things without much knowledge of it. All I would therefore say is, we know that in general, when the West starts projecting onto a substance or a plant or whatever, with good reason, there's something really important here, then often local economies suffer and the plant or the animal itself suffers. So you would expect that there's cause for concern. But it may well be, and it's often complex, it may well be that this attention ends up helping the local Seri indigenous community. There's some evidence that a lot of people are getting off methamphetamine through, just like Enrique, and that they may well develop a secondary, they may get revitalized. But it will be, speaking, I think, as an anthropologist here, I think it will have to be in some ways an invention of a tradition, or a reinvention on the basis of the kind of intuitive knowledge received in those states, rather than something that, has an obvious continuity going back thousands of years.
Thanks so much, Bas. Please thank Sebastian Job.